Well, this album needs no introduction. An album that is known for being the black sheep of the Metallica discography, but not only that, the black sheep of heavy metal as a genre. Some people even going as far as to call it the worst heavy metal album of all time. What are we talking about?
Saint Anger! Saint Anger! Saint Anger!
Saint Anger. And what a time to revisit such a classic in all the wrong ways, for all the wrong reasons, than the 20th anniversary year of Saint Anger. I can't say month because it was released on June 5th of 2003, so I'm off by like 2 months, give or take, but I wasn't reviewing content at the time when the album came out, so I'm going to put out my 20th anniversary review / analysis right now. So 20 years have gone by, and basically there are two camps. You either love this album or hate this album. And everyone and their mother who reviews content on YouTube has reviewed this album, pretty much seemingly but me. I have done a versus video with this album versus Risk, and I was pretty harsh on this album, also calling it the worst heavy metal album of all time, or at least one of, and I don't necessarily feel that way anymore. I hadn't heard the album at that time in about 5 years or so. Now it's been since, I want to say 2008, 2007, somewhere around there. It was right before Death Magnetic came out, and I hadn't heard the album in its entirety since then. I had only heard a couple songs here and there, but never the album through and through until today, where I listened to it on repeat 2 or 3 times, and also listened to a couple of albums similar in style from around that era by different bands, such as System of a Down's Toxicity and a little bit of The Untouchables by Korn. Some bands that are nu metal / alternative, heavy metal, whatever you want to call it, that are pretty similar in style, and that will come into play a little bit further. Now, we are going to be giving Saint Anger the fairest of fair shakes here, while analyzing every 2 or 3 negatives. There is at least one positive for this album. Is it a bad album? Yes. I will say unequivocally, Saint Anger is a bad Metallica album. Is it so bad it is apocalyptic to the point where it would be deemed the worst heavy metal album of all time? Is it so bad that it's just noise, it's unsalvageable? No. But it ain't no hidden masterpiece. In order to understand where this album came from, you need to understand the mindset of the band at the time. But as this album has been reviewed to death, I am going to give you guys the Cliff Notes version of it, and that is James Hetfield went to rehab. He was relapsing in his alcoholism from the early to mid-80s, later 80s, especially after Cliff Burton had passed tragically. It was really affecting his mood. He could not focus on a bunch of other stuff. There was Napster, the Napster incident with their music being stolen from them, their fans turning on them, massive protests with people stomping on albums of theirs, CDs. This is all well documented. There was also Jason Newsted leaving the band after over 10 years, over a decade with them. And that is basically the entire Cliff Notes version of it. I highly suggest, if you want more information, to watch the Some Kind of Monster documentary on this. It goes in great detail on the makings and the production of Saint Anger. Now, Saint Anger is an interesting album, and I say that, as I've already said, this is a bad album. However, it's not bad to the apocalyptic level that people are saying it is. It's easy to look back in hindsight and say that it's not that bad of an album, or it's even kind of a hidden gem in Metallica's discography when you consider the albums that came after it that were basically fan service. Now, I myself really like Death Magnetic. Not really too big on 72 Seasons and Hardwired to Self-Destruct, but that is for a different video that I will be getting into when I eventually maybe review those albums. Up until this point, Metallica were trend followers. In the 1980s, they were trendsetters. They were paving the roads for many a heavy metal / thrash metal, speed metal, you name it, band to do their own thing. And basically, they were making the trends themselves. However, there was a shift in the winds. The winds were blowing in a different direction for heavy metal as a whole, and thrash and speed metal weren't exactly favored. They were on their way out. So radio stations would not play a lot of these metal bands. And we weren't necessarily into the era where they would be considered classics on, say, a classic rock station. Whereas now you have the pigeonhole, you have to have the new bands on one station, on the modern rock station, and the classic bands on the classic rock station. However, none of the newer stuff by the classic bands ever gets played on the modern station. So it's kind of a weird dynamic we have now with radio, and it was even weirder back then. So they basically had to step up their game and become trend followers, and their music, in a way, kind of suffered for it. Now, I myself really like Load. Not too big of a fan of Reload, but Load in and of itself was a pretty decent grunge and alternative album. It had a lot of hard rock influences, but I would say that the domineering force was Alice in Chains, a band in which they were close to at the time. So, Saint Anger is no different. However, I do see a lot of nu metal influences as well as heavy metal, not necessarily thrash, but it is closer to their thrash roots than they have been on Load and Reload back in the mid to late 90s. So when it comes to Saint Anger, the band refers to it as a cleansing period of sorts, where they basically got all their angst, all their energy, all their raw emotion together in a garage band setting where they wanted it to be the most raw and angry and stripped down album they have ever produced. There's no guitar solos. They play down-tuned guitars. James Hetfield sings out of key, shouts into the microphone, "Kill, kill, kill." That's how the entire album ends. And I gotta say, there are some moments on this album that truly shine. For every 2 or 3 negatives, there's at least one positive glimmering in there. And I will say that Shoot Me Again is not only a good song by Metallica in terms of Saint Anger, but it's just a good Metallica song in general. But it also displays a lot of the negative tendencies that all of these songs suffer for, which is why I'm not going to do it track by track. Every single one of these songs has the exact same problem, and it is not the production. It's not even the snare drums. It's the length. It's not even James Hetfield singing off key. It is the length of every single song on here, which feels like they have had riffs tacked onto them to make them artificially longer, just so that they can say that they have a 7 or 8 minute song for each and every single track on this album. And that is a problem, because every single song, the title track included, is about 1 to 4 minutes too long. There's a radio edit of Some Kind of Monster that takes out parts of the intro, and I'm not sure if it takes out anything from the middle of the song or not, but it is 10 times the song that the original Some Kind of Monster is. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Some Kind of Monster is a bad song, again, in terms of Saint Anger. However, the shortened version, when compared to it, is a lot better, and it flows a lot nicer with the rest of the album. Now, there's a lot of influences here from the early 2000s with the down-tuned guitars. Grunge was on its way out, with alternative sort of taking the reins from there. From then on, we would have a genre known as post-grunge, which still had the blown-out guitar amp sort of sound to it. The distortion was up high, and it would be down-tuned guitars. It would still sound somewhat like grunge, but it would be more in the alternative hard rock area. And I would say that Saint Anger fits this like a T. It almost sounds exactly like Toxicity by System of a Down in its production, as well as the down-tuned guitars and the snare drums to a lesser extent. Now, one big problem with Saint Anger is its drums are turned up way too loud in the mix.
Oh God, Saint Anger again. Oh no.
And I think if they brought the drums back a little bit and maybe put less emphasis on the clang of the drums, making it sound like a trash can, like you're banging on a trash can, I think the album would have merited from it. I think it definitely would have benefited from that. The album doesn't necessarily need a re-recording or a reimagining. It just needs a remixing, I believe. And the Toxicity comparison, I don't make that comparison lightly because you will never unhear it. Just listen to Prison Song or Chop Suey or even the title track, Toxicity, and you will hear Saint Anger's production. You're welcome, now you can never unhear it. So, there was a lot of influence from System of a Down. Whether or not they want to admit it, I'm pretty sure that that's what it was. And there's a lot of influence as well from Korn, I would say, because as I was listening to the album The Untouchables, I could definitely hear a lot of influence from that as well. And Jonathan Davis sort of has these moments where he'll sing off-key or out of key and make these kind of weird noises, I guess, with his vocal cords, with his vocal ability, and I was definitely seeing that a little bit with the off-key singing of James Hetfield. Maybe that's just wishful thinking on my end, or maybe he really was suffering with a lot of emotional anxiety and issues back then with the recording. So as I said before, every single song on here has the exact same problem, and that is the length. So with that, Shoot Me Again is definitely my favorite track on the album. I also love the intro riff to Saint Anger, the title track, and Frantic, I think, is a pretty decent song. However, there are points about 3/4 of the way through these songs where I believe they should have ended, and they just keep tacking on extra guitar riffs. So if you're not going to solo, these riffs just seem completely pointless and out of left field, and they don't really make sense in the context of the song other than to artificially make the songs longer. And I know I'm basically saying the same thing in different ways, but it is a major problem with the flow of the album. It is way too long. The production I can deal with. The clanging of the trash cans I can deal with. The off-key or out-of-key singing by James Hetfield sort of adds a unique charm to this album. And that is one thing that is severely lacking from Death Magnetic, Hardwired to Self-Destruct, and 72 Seasons, is its own sense of identity. Every single Metallica album up to this point has been made by Metallica doing what they do for themselves. Back in the 1980s, I think it's probably 1986, 1985, there was an interview where Lars Ulrich told the reporter, or the journalist who was doing the interview, that Metallica is an inward-thinking band. They do things for themselves and for themselves only. If people want to say that they've sold out, then whatever, they don't care. This was the last album where I believe Metallica had that mindset, where they would do things for themselves, and they wouldn't really care what the fans thought. And they would do the things that they would enjoy, because this album basically started the trajectory that the band is on right now, where the next 3 albums would just be Metallica trying to appease their fan base and do things that would be considered safe in the realm of hard rock and heavy metal and thrash metal. Death Magnetic is, of course, a return to form, in my opinion. I really enjoyed that album. I enjoyed it a lot more when it came out than what I currently enjoy it. The loudness war was definitely a factor in that. It suffers from a huge amount of compression and distortion and static, and Rick Rubin isn't necessarily one of my favorite producers, but as far as how Saint Anger marked a difference, an end of an era, if you will, in many different ways, that was, I think, the biggest downfall of Saint Anger, is it caused such a massive fan backlash that the band started to become unsure of themselves and didn't make the music the way they wanted to. They wanted to make the music for the fans, which can be a good thing. However, it doesn't feel like their heart is in it. And this is especially evident on Hardwired to Self-Destruct, where they basically take a bunch of different styles, an amalgamation of different styles with heavy metal and hard rock, and throw it at the wall, and they see what sticks. And they take the exact same approach with 72 Seasons. The same producer, I think it's Greg Feldman, but correct me if I'm wrong. I know the producer of every single Metallica album up until I keep forgetting Hardwired and 72 Seasons, but these albums just strike me as playing it safe. Metallica by the numbers. What do the fans want? After Death Magnetic was basically a return to form, they just wanted to do the same thing over and over again. They hadn't really had that inward drive for what do we want to do? And really, Saint Anger is the culmination of that, of their raw angst and emotion and everything that they were going through. And the album is kind of unique for that. It kind of has its own appeal as far as that's concerned. So, is the album the worst heavy metal album of all time? No. Unequivocally no. Is it a dumpster fire? No. Is it the next Beethoven? Is it a hidden magnum opus by Metallica that is the best thing since sliced bread? Also no. As with anything, the truth lies somewhere right down in the middle. It's a bad Metallica album, but it's got some really good elements to it. Now, if you think I need to hop off the fence, like I said, I do think it is a bad album. I myself am not very privy to it. I don't really care much for it. But with that, I have to admit that it does have some endearing things about it, such as Shoot Me Again being one of my favorite songs off of the album, also transcending to be just a good Metallica song in general. Now, Lacuna Coil, Coma Lies XX. The last album that I reviewed was Coma Lies XX, and that album is a reimagining of a classic that came out actually coincidentally a year before Metallica's Saint Anger. And that album, Coma Lies, completely different genres, but Coma Lies XX is a reimagining of that album in Lacuna Coil's current style. If Metallica were to do something like that and take Saint Anger and bring it into the modern day, I think that it would greatly benefit, and it would sound a lot better and a lot crisper, a lot clearer, a lot cleaner. You wouldn't have a lot of the overblown out guitars, down-tuned guitars, overblown out, I was going to say production. You wouldn't have distortion cranked up to the max. You wouldn't have the trash can drums. But then I started asking myself, do we really need that? Part of the allure of it is its identity. If you brought it into the era of Hardwired to Self-Destruct and 72 Seasons, it would just sound like another Metallica by the Numbers album, and I think it would lose a part of itself in the process. And then that's not to say that cleaning up some of it and remixing the album and re-releasing it for the 20th anniversary wouldn't do it some justice, but I think going in and re-recording the album entirely in a different style that it was never meant to be isn't exactly the way to go about that. But those are just my thoughts. I would say that this album is a 5.5 out of 10. I wouldn't go any further than that, just to basically escape the bottom of the barrel for this one. 5.5 out of 10. And that is my final rating. This is Midnight Strike 3625. Thank you very much for watching. Keep calm and rock on.